So there, let me give you a little background on this slide. It really is my favorite picture in the world. This was taken at the Aikido Matsuri, the Aikido festival or Aikido high holiday, which was celebrated annually at the Aikido shrine in Iwama, which O-sensei built, basically. And I went up a day early and helped clean the shrine and helped sweep around the shrine. And there were a couple of Aikidos I knew from Hombu Dojo who also went up. And so we swept the dojo itself because a lot of people came and we all had lunch together there. And we were in our gis all the time. And one of the people from Tokyo was Kato Sensei. He was not yet eighth dan. I don't know what his rank was, but he was certainly, as others told me, the scariest guy at Hombu Dojo, besides the senior Aikidos. So he was there, and I was there in my gi because I had been cleaning up, and O-sensei motioned to me and called me up to be a zuke. I came right after Satome-san. So it was a huge honor, and everybody was there. All of his senior students came from all over Japan. And of course, I felt extremely incompetent to take ukemi in front of everybody, but at least I didn't make too much of a fool of myself. Thank you. Slide 2. So this is a beautiful picture of O-sensei. It may have been at another Aikido Matsuri. It may have been at the same one that you saw above, because that picture was taken by a dear friend of mine named Henry Kono, who was Japanese-Canadian. And I think this was the same Matsuri, the same celebration, that he took this beautiful picture of O-sensei. And this is a quote from O-sensei that basically, the floating bridge of heaven is the turning of fire and water. Now, in Japanese, fire and water is often used instead of yin and yang, and especially in Shinto. So Sensei used it that way here. Fire moves water, water is moved by fire, and yet they're one thing, as you know by the Chinese circle with the black and the white with a spiral separating them. There's that spiral, and it's interesting. He goes on and says they're entwined through ki. Iki, breath, is aiki, and O-sensei used a number of play on words like that. Now, the man who took these pictures, Henry Kono, at one point asked O-sensei, how come nobody's Aikido is anything like yours? And O-sensei smiled and said, because they don't understand yin and yang. And Henry spent years, he took that really seriously and spent years investigating what in the world is yin and yang, or at least what was O-sensei's understanding about yin and yang. So it's he took it very seriously and developed a unique style of Aikido based on what he'd learned from O-sensei. O-sensei also said the floating bridge symbolizes an enlightened state of being, the person who speaks and acts truly, and that would be tadashi in Japanese, sincerely, honestly, truly, is always standing on the floating bridge. So it's really a state of mind reflected in one's actions. Next slide. And here we come to the Shinto myth itself. It's a little hard to read the kanji up above. I know they're a little vague, so I apologize for that. So this is a famous Hiroshige woodblock print. And the floating bridge, or literally the floating bridge of heaven, Ame no Ukihashi, is an ancient, it comes from the Kojiki, is very ancient Shinto scripture, which goes back to something like 600 AD. It's the oldest scripture in Japan, and it's really a collection of myths, hymns, legends, and philosophies. And it opens pretty much with this myth, with this story that the other divine beings created Izanagi no Omikami and Izanami no Omikami, or literally the male or he who invites and she who invites. And they were given a jeweled spear. And this is, again, a very important concept for O-sensei. They were given by the elder divine beings something called Ama no Nuhoko, a jeweled spear, a spear with one great jewel or jewels in it. And hoko is an ancient Japanese term for spears. Early spears, they're actually made differently than the later spears, which were made with a tang that got inserted into the staff, whereas these were called socketed spears, not that you probably care, but the spearhead ended in sort of a cone that fit over the top of the spear staff. And they were given this magical staff, and together they grasped the spear and stirred the sort of uncreated chaos or the uncreated ocean, and which created a vortex, something like a whirlpool. And that uncreated matter sort of solidified or became brine, seawater, and the drops of that brine fell down to earth and created the first island, the first solid ground, which was called the island of Onogoro. And I'm not sure where Onogoro is exactly. I think it's just a legendary first spot, and it may well be part of in parts of Japan. They say, well, this shrine is where the drop fell, and it's where things were created. So it was male and female standing on this floating bridge, which was neither heaven nor earth, but really is a bridge between heaven and earth. But it's a space between heaven and earth. So it's a place of creativity. It's creating the physical universe. And when this island was created, Izanagi and Izanami moved to it and created a shrine and a pillar, and they suddenly, it's a very cute story because at one point she looks at him and she said, wow, what a nice looking man you are. And he said, what a beautiful woman you are. And they didn't quite know what to do about it because sex hadn't been invented yet. So they invented sex. And so the first biological creation happened after the physical creation that occurred on the floating bridge. So again, this is a very rich, if you think about this as a rich myth. O-sensei is saying we must stand on the floating bridge, which is this place between heaven and earth that's you're not locked into either place, but floating, free. And it's a place of ultimate creativity, which means having an open mind that's in the present, that is not caught by anything. So this is, I don't know why they're not showing the spear here. Next slide, you get to see the spear or an artist's rendition. Now, there are two things wrong with this, and it's always important to remember artists may paint beautiful pictures of myths, but they're artists. They're not mythologists. Number one is the man gets to hold the spear. So the Japanese male chauvinism is still alive and well. And it looks more like a naginata. The blade is slightly curved. And I've seen pictures of the old hoko, which is straight. It's a straight spear. Not that anybody cares but me. Next slide. Now here is O-sensei reenacting this myth. And what almost no one points out is, I trained virtually 7 days a week at Hombu Dojo for 2.5 years. And whenever O-sensei came out, before he began Aikido, he would do some version of what we call today Shinko-kyu, Shinto purification exercise, which began with him holding a staff or a spear and spiraling it up, and then extending upward. And those of us who trained with Kato Sensei know that part of his Misogi no Jo, purification practice, is exactly that. That's the beginning of it. So, and notice that incredible focus on connecting with heaven. It's, just watching that alone is a lesson in itself, I think. And again, that's how he began Aikido practice, by reminding himself and ideally reminding his audience. But of course, most of us didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But at least reminding himself that Aikido is standing on the floating bridge. So he enacted it in his body. And I sent the quote out to some of you. In the way, you must first stand on the floating bridge of heaven. If you do not stand on the floating bridge, Aikido will not come forth. So this is a must for him to practice Aikido as he understood it. Next slide. And these are some quotes. I do strongly recommend that you all reread or read for the first time The Secret Teachings of Aikido, which are translations by John Stevens. And of all his books, I think this is one of the richest. It's a series of talks that O-sensei gave for the students of a colleague, a friend of his, who was roughly one of his contemporaries. And he got more philosophical than he normally did talking in the dojo. So these are fascinating quotes about the deep meaning of the floating bridge of heaven. Moving on to the next slide. This is a slide from the Aikido archives. I don't know where it came from originally. It's the old Hombu Dojo, I believe, but it might be somewhere else. It looks like the old Hombu Dojo before the new one was built. And notice that position. When most people do Ikkyo Undo, it's sort of here, just like, almost like you're doing a fencing move. Or you're doing an Aikido, a block for something, whereas he's extending up to heaven. When Kato Sensei taught us, he always said over and over again, raise higher, raise the staff higher, raise the sword higher, really connect to heaven. So that I would call Jodan Kamai, which is the higher of the three stances. It could be the beginning of a Shomen cut, or simply extending to heaven. It really could be either one or both. And notice O-sensei's Hara. I mean, he's also demonstrating this notion that you can connect to heaven and be grounded in the earth. He's clearly grounded. So he's not doing this and letting the raising of his arms and extending upward take him out of his Hara, take him out of his connection to the earth. So again, this is another picture worth 1,000 or 10,000 words. Next slide. And again, this is O-sensei explaining in more detail than he often did. The left and right of the flowing bridge are our own left and right. We're made in God's image, and Izanagi is the physical aspect of earth. Izanami is the spiritual element. So the male is the physical, the female is the spiritual. And he said, now we should think of the physical and spiritual as one rather than separate them. And I think that's a pretty good definition of Aikido. The Aikido which we'd all like to understand, which we'd all like to practice, which is how can we practice Aikido with the physical and the spiritual connected, or as a practice which includes heaven and earth, which is a metaphor for physical and spiritual. Next slide. This is another absolutely beautiful slide in which, as we saw with the slide with his top off, you can see he's focused on his Hara and also extending up all the way up to heaven. He's chanting. So the chant was one of his main spiritual practices, and it came from the Hara, but in order for it to be a spiritual practice, it came from your Hara and connected you to heaven. So he would chant, so I could do that better, but I've been staying at home, so my chanting has suffered because of that. He did say to me, by the way, talking about physical and spiritual, he mentioned, and I've never seen this anywhere else, Aikido is spiritual purification or spiritual development, Physical Aikido is merely for the development of the body. That could go over the entrance to every dojo, and actually might give us a perspective on Aikido that would help us find the sort of audience we want for it, but who knows? Anyhow, I do love this, both this picture and this notion of balance, of grounded in Hara and connecting to heaven and chanting. Next, this is a dynamite picture. I've never seen anything like this. When people say, oh, Sensei did this airy-fairy Aikido, doesn't look like it from this picture. His old students used to say it was very frightening to train in the dojo. We were afraid every time he did a technique, he'd break our arms or our necks. I mean, he put out that kind of energy. Gozo Shioda wrote that O-sensei was invited to do an Aikido demonstration at the Imperial Palace for the Imperial family. And he was sick. He had a fever, and his students said, well, don't go. He said, I have to. I'm invited by the emperor. And one of his best students came at him. He only took two ukes. One was Shioda, and the other was a guy who used to take ukemi with a 7-foot spear. I forget his name. And the first attacker came in holding back a little bit because he felt O-sensei was sick and he didn't want to exhaust O-sensei. And O-sensei threw him so hard, he didn't attack in a focused enough way. O-sensei, I think, broke his arm, or at least injured him. And Shioda said, for the next 40 minutes, I was his only uke, and I was in bed for a week afterwards. So that's the O-sensei that did that. It's a good reminder. It's also a fascinating reminder of a balance between the vertical and the horizontal. And I would say this is the yang side of standing on the floating bridge. There's not a lot of yin in there at this moment. It's really astonishing. Next slide. So this again comes from the secrets of Aikido. We need misogi, or cleansing of both body and spirit, and ame uki hashi. Ame is heaven. Uki is floating, as in ukiyo-e, or pictures from the floating world, and hashi is bridge. And one of O-sensei's practices was kotodama, which is to chant, and also, and this is according to Shinto interpretation of syllables. So the a is self. So remember, O-sensei said, masakatsu agatsu. Real victory is agatsu, self-victory. So that's the a in self. Me is to revolve. U is vertical. Ki is energy. So we have this sense of energy revolving, going upward. Ha is horizontal, so you have the vertical and horizontal, and Shi is the integration of those two. And that's just the sort of spiritual interpretation of those sounds, which different teachers would do differently, but this was O-sensei's. So a big part of this is really being connected to both vertical and horizontal dimensions. Next slide. Again, a gorgeous picture of O-sensei really demonstrating this integration of, it's really heaven and earth in this case, rather than vertical and horizontal. Notice how alive his fingers are, slightly spread, filled with ki. And that definitely, by the way, this is by Henry Kono. This is Hombu Dojo. This picture was taken in 1965. And the reason I can tell is by the plywood covering some of the windows and doors, because they were building next door to Hombu Dojo, the current Hombu. They tore down O-sensei's house and built this 3-4-story building. That's the current Hombu Dojo, and kept the old dojo, so we still practiced to the sounds of construction. Next slide. And here again is another explanation of heaven and earth. And O-sensei, again, in an interesting way, is bringing right and left together, but is also, his fingers are pointing to heaven. So it's a connection from where he is up to heaven. So that's pretty much what I put together in the PowerPoint. I don't know if that illuminated anything or just made you more confused. I'm happy either way. So maybe we'll take some questions. Well, at least give me 21st century. Don't lock me into a year. It's something I've worked with in various forms. Jung talked about it. And what Jung said is, he didn't specifically mention the floating bridge, but the floating bridge is an incredible example of a liminal space. Limen is an old Latin word for threshold. And so subliminal, for example, we use for sounds that are subliminal are below the threshold of our hearing. They're subaudible. But a threshold space is, Jung also called it a place that is between, a space between. It's not here and it's not there. And let me suggest that all the important stuff ideally happens in this place. For example, if you want to pray, you don't think about the book you read yesterday or business deals you want to do tomorrow or whatever. You're supposed to be in a space between in which you're just praying. You're not thinking about daily life. A dojo is a space between. And by the way, dojo, of course, referred initially to a place where Zen monks meditated, where they focused on witnessing their inner world, seeing a therapist, praying. Many things happen best when you can enter this place of being neither here nor there. Ramdas's great 20th century version was "Be Here Now," which is another way of saying somewhat the same thing. So that's, I think that's at least the beginning. And I think each of us can think of other examples in our own lives that are similar. I mean, for me, the years I spent in Japan were standing on the floating bridge. I wasn't home. I was a visitor in Japan. And I think the spiritual work I did, from meditation to Aikido to meeting my spiritual teachers, was really powerful because I was in that place. I wasn't rooted. If Tokyo was home, I'd be rooted in home. But it wasn't. It was a place I was visiting, and I knew I would leave to go back home. And at one point I thought maybe I loved Tokyo so much I would make it home. I would move there. And it took my second trip for me to realize it wasn't home. It was a place where I learned a phenomenal amount, but the work I had to do had to be done at home, even though I couldn't articulate it very well. So you're right. I think Sensei used this fabulous myth, and he probably may very well have learned it from his teacher, Oniguchi de Saburo, who's a great Shinto teacher. But it's a very rich and evocative myth of this place of creativity, of this place of generativity. So that would be my first cut. Great question, Scott. I think you're absolutely right. We should do that with everything in Aikido. What is it for the 21st century? Not what was it when Sensei first learned it. Yes. Let me give you an example from my Sufi experience. There's an old saying in Sufism. We practice what's called zikr, a form of chanting, prayer, meditation, all wrapped up into one. And as you start chanting, the old saying goes that you begin with the zikr of the remembrance, the chanting of the tongue. That is, you're speaking names of God or holy phrases, but you're speaking them willfully, the way we speak normally in everyday life. So, and that's true no matter what you're chanting. So you start by chanting Om, 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 and I'm very consciously doing it. But then they say, as you continue to do it, the chant descends to the chanting of the heart, to the remembrance of the heart, and it comes out of you. Rather than you push it out with will, it feels like you're not doing it, you're allowing this to happen, but it's coming from inside. And then they say, finally, if you practice long enough, it becomes the zikr, the remembrance of the soul, which you're touching your own soul. But it's the same practice, it just deepens. And I wonder whether there's a way in which the repetition of Aikido, the simplest forms of Aikido, whether it's weapons or taijutsu, isn't like that. That as we continue to do the same, roughly outer form, and we do it over and over again, it goes deeper. And instead of doing memorized movements, it becomes more response mirroring of our partners, something that comes out of a place of wisdom and understanding in us. But I think you got to warm up to get to that place. And I think that may be one of the secrets of Aikido, and perhaps us as Aikido teachers could set up classes so that that happens more often. Maybe by starting slowly, and then moving it to a more normal pace or something. I don't know, but it's a great, it's a great question again. Sure. I would like to suggest that we're so used to acting from our egos and being in control. Our egos love to be in control. And giving up control scares the hell out of the ego. So it's awkward, it's confusing. The ego tries to talk us into not doing it. But in fact, there's great value in becoming comfortable not knowing. And in fact, there's a brilliant classic in Western mystical literature called The Cloud of Unknowing that was written sometime in the Middle Ages. And it's, and in a sense, the author is saying the only way you can get close to God is going to a place of not knowing. And the work is unknowing, not adding more stuff. So it's, this is a very rich myth and a very rich reality. And the problem was everybody got stuck on the esoteric, ununderstandable Shinto piece. But the truths that are underneath this, I think, are A, found in all religions, and B, we can use them to inform our own sort of context for Aikido. Yeah, I would too. Well, I think one of the most important things about Aikido is intention. What intention do you bring into the dojo? Why are you practicing Aikido? And I remember when I was training at Hombu Dojo, I would look around and I could tell what intention people had. There were actually 4 groups of people training all at the same time, but we're all doing something different. There were the high school kids who wanted to be strong and, sort of be more martial and sort of macho. And it was very clear in the way they did Aikido. It was very physical. It was aerobic. And these were the sort of college groups that would do push-ups and sit-ups and carry each other upstairs on their backs. So there was this whole very demanding aerobic background that was part of the context. And then there were people who I would train with who would often scare the shit out of me. And they're the ones who did Aikido as a martial art. And it was very serious. And they would treat every interaction as though I was really trying to kill them. And every time they attacked me, they were trying to kill me. Now, they would have been horrified to actually have killed me or even hospitalized me, but it had that element, it had that incredible edge that real Budo practice has. And unless you practice with someone like that, and I almost never encounter that practice in the United States, but I did in Japan. I knew one guy, he was in Shingu, and he was promoted to 6th Dan when he was in his late 20s, which is unbelievable in Japan. He had to have been incredibly good. And he would come into the main dojo, which is Hikizuchi Sensei's dojo, who was 10th Dan. And he would start by training with one of the young black belts. And within the first minute, he would either bloody his nose or his mouth. I watched him do a demonstration. They had a Matsuri, a festival in his area where he had his dojo. He had 4 very scared adults who would twitch every time he moved, and a huge group, maybe 20 youngsters, who would do forward rolls and cartwheels and had a great time. And I went up to him and I said, "Sensei, how come you have so many happy, active children and you have sort of depressed, scared adults?" I don't know that I dared put it that way. too long ago, I can't remember. And he looked at me and he said very seriously, he said, "Bob-san, with the children, I pull my atemi." So, of course, when he trained with adults, guess what? He didn't. That was the martial. I mean, it's totally different practice from the college kids who were doing aerobic and didn't know they were wide open to a martial artist because they were really doing a form of soccer, rugby, whatever, or judo, which again became a sport. And then there were people who, well, you find this more in the States, people who do Aikido because they want to be more centered. And it's sort of like Tai Chi with partners and real throwing. And that's another context entirely. And then finally, there are those who really did it for self-transcendence, generally older students. And in almost every case, the older teachers were teaching that Aikido. And the strange thing was this group didn't understand each other. So the older teacher would be teaching something very much like O-sensei's Aikido. And the college kids kept doing their aerobic Aikido. The martial artists kept doing their, I'll punch you if I see an opening, and I'll, life and death in something very close to that. So it was, I forget where we started, but I think it's about intention. It's like, can we read enough and contemplate enough to bring the intention of what, for lack of a better word, I call self-development, self-transcendence to Aikido. We're not doing it to be stronger. We're not doing it to show off. We're not doing it to get hash marks on our gi or some stupid certificate. I mean, I love having my certificate up, which almost nobody can read but me and a few Japanese. So who cares? It could be a laundry list or something. You never know. Most would. But I do think, and my experience founding and running a school for years was that I had a school dedicated to people developing themselves to transcendence. And it worked because people had that intention. That was, and I think the more we can build that into our dojos, the better. The problem is it gets very, very confusing because there's all this Budo stuff. And most of it is dumbed down because we don't have these guys that are trying to kill us whenever they attack us. So we have something that's it's not quite like the floating bridge, but it's neither here nor there. We don't train out hard enough that it's really aerobic. It's not really martial because very few people can take that. And unfortunately, it's not really self-transcended either. I mean, it reminds me, one of my old students would go down to Los Angeles with me to teach it. I had a company dojo there for 10 years in LA. And we would bring Kato Sensei down twice a year whenever he came. And my student was the most advanced student in the class, so he took ukemi all the time for Kato Sensei. When we came back through the LA airport, bells went off, and these people said, take your water bottle out, you forgot. And he said, I don't have a water bottle in my bag. And some armed guy came over with his hand on his gun, And he said, no, all I have, and he opened it up, he said, this is my keikogi. And then he pulled it, I said, feel it. And it was soaking wet. I mean, that was really aerobic Aikido. It actually set the alarms off. So I do think we suffer from being neither fish nor fowl. And I don't have an easy answer. I think we may need either different dojos or different instructors, each of whom is very consciously dedicated to teaching a different aspect of Aikido. It shouldn't be all vanilla. The Japanese is ame, heaven, no, which is a possessive, ukihashi, which is floating bridge. So the literal translation, but I think it's floating bridge of heaven. That's because it's floating, it's not quite in heaven either. Or, I think it's more like there's, again, in Shinto, in Sufism, there's an interesting notion of what's called a barzak, another space between. And the image given is it's like an isthmus in which you have water. It divides water on each side of it. So let's say you could have the Atlantic Ocean on one side and a bay on the other side. And the isthmus connects the two of them, but also separates the two. And I think that's another powerful image, and I think that's sort of what the floating bridge is it's like something between heaven and earth, so it separates them and also connects them. But literally, it's the floating bridge of heaven. Well, it's exactly mirrors my experience of now 45 years of my school. I've ran this school and then taught at it, and I'm deeply connected from 1975 to now. And we've graduated, I don't know, maybe a couple of thousand students. And they've almost all said it's been it's helped them in terribly important ways in their own growth, even though the faculty has changed over several times, even though the curriculum has changed, even though we put in new programs, even though back in '84 we moved to programs that were distance learning only. But something worked in spite of all the superficial outer changes. And I think that's true of Aikido, that something is built into the techniques. And, even though it's those of us who are connected with Hombu Dojo tend to superficially say, well, Yoshinkan, which is hard style, it's physical and it's used to train police. But nevertheless, you look at the old Yoshinkan teachers or the Daitoryu teachers, who it's pre-Aikido, it's really jujitsu. They do the most incredible flowing, blending, extension of ki stuff I've ever seen, better than 99% of the Hombu Aikido team. So I wonder whether O-sensei's intentions, O-sensei's spirit is in an interesting, strange way, is built into the waza of Aikido. And I go back to what I've said. Some of you have heard me say this, but I don't care. I like to repeat myself. One of the great British pioneers of judo was a man named Trevor Leggett, who studied judo, I think, in the 30s. And he also studied Zen very seriously. And one of the things he said every judo waza is a koan. It's one of those wonderful Zen, unanswerable questions designed to take you out of your head, so slap you upside your head so that you might think different. And I would definitely say every waza in Aikido is a koan. So that may be part of it, that because I think the way we do Aikido, I mean, compared to judo, Aikido is much more inscrutable, for lack of a better word. There's a mystery in Aikido, in the very techniques of Aikido, that may touch that part of us. Again, the question about Jung and Aikido, let me get back to it. Jung said we all have a self with a capital S, the same as soul in most religions. And I think Aikido touches the soul, and I think helps build a connection, our connection with our souls as we practice. And the amazing thing is it's a physical practice that does it. It's not sitting and being mindful or chanting or whatever. It's actually doing a physical practice in which we're looking at physical outcomes, and yet somehow there's this spiritual benefit which has to do with somehow we're expressing our souls at best in Aikido. I've never put it that way before, so thank you all for drawing that out of me. But that would be an interesting way if we wanted. I keep thinking we could market better that Aikido is a way of expressing your soul. Now that would bring a lot of crazy people who.
That works in the Bay Area and Portland.
Right. Yeah, exactly. People who live in trees and eat fruit and nuts, sort of. We used to have in Santa Cruz. Remember, I started first in Berkeley and then in Santa Cruz. So I had those students. They were great.
A lot of them are still practicing Aikido.
That's true. A lot of them are. I remember the first year I taught, there was one of the guys who again had long hair and was sort of out of it. I think he drove a motorcycle. And he had a little bit of a limp. And in the middle of the riots in Berkeley where the police were beating on anybody that looked like a hippie, and he looked like everybody they were beating on. He had longer hair. And he emphasized his limp a little more, and he had a cane. So he had a weapon in his hand. And he would walk across the street, and the policeman he would meet the policeman, look them in the eye, not angry and not afraid, and centered. And they would help him across the street because he limped. Mm. And I said, Jesus, what are you doing? You're putting yourself at risk. He said, this is the most incredible Aikido practice. So that was that was way back in 1968, probably. Mm. But yeah, I mean, it was, and another one who, Paul Linden, who some of you know, went on to become a very well-known Aikido teacher. And he was more out of it back in 68. He was walking with his jo over his hand and his gi sort of threaded through the jo, so he looked like a bum, with carrying a stick and carrying all his belongings. And this police car pulled up with a screech right next to him. And one of the cops saw this long-haired, sort of vague-eyed guy, and they said, what do you got there? And he said, oh, this is my jo. I use it to practice Aikido, which is a martial art of peace. And the one cop turned to the other one, he said, oh, one of those, let him go. And the trick wasn't the words. The trick was he was absolutely, totally sincere that he was doing the best he could to describe Aikido. God bless. He's written some wonderful books, and he's worked with people with trauma and all kinds of problems and applied Aikido, in many wonderful ways. And I think he's got some ebooks out that you can get off the web. Paul Linden, Linden. And again, I'm just putting in a plug for Stevens' book, John Stevens, and that one is Secret Teachings of Aikido. It's right on top of my cheat sheet, so I should have seen it. So thank you all. This has been a pleasure. Next week, I will probably look at another way of looking at heaven and earth and looking at the idea of where is the horizontal, maintain the vertical as we act horizontally.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Yeah. So thank you all, and tell your friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frager Shihan.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Great to see
So
everyone.
great to see you.
Thank you, Sensei.
Great to see all of you.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Good night.